Hi, I'm here today at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center in Portland, Oregon. We are going to be talking about 5 frontier-inspired recipes that you can make at home. So let's get into it. So when you think of the Oregon Trail, what do you picture? Maybe you think of covered wagons and oxen driving across the plains, or maybe
you think of Native American tribes who have lived here for generations.
Did you know that people were traveling on the Oregon Trail from 1841 all the way to about 1909? And what we ate during that time period really changed. So today we're not just talking about what Native Americans were eating or even what the most common foods were on the trail. We're looking at what was eaten during that entire time period. And some of the foods that you might find surprising. Our first recipe is something that you can make at home. And this is actually an old recipe from 1847. This is a boil-in-the-bag pudding. In modern times, this was the closest thing to fast food that pioneers could get. You can make this at home pretty simply. And so they would put rice or wheat or barley, cornmeal, and then any dried fruit that they had with them. They would mix that all together and they would tie it up in a handkerchief or whatever cloth that they had. They would drop it in their pot and then they would boil it for quite a while. This is pretty easy to do at home. So why don't we go ahead and try it out? Alright, so I've got our boil-in-the-bag pudding all tied up. Here is our pudding. As you can see, it's been boiled in its little cloth bag. And so now we're going to open it up and see how it came out. So this pudding did cook for quite a long time. This is one of the things you learn when you re-cooking frontier style. Is there not a lot of ways to speed up the cooking process. So it takes a lot longer. So this isn't something that you could throw together quickly for dinner. This is definitely a frontier food. The next recipe we're making today is something that every pioneer family would have had, and that is dried fruit. But it's important to remember that dried fruit wasn't always dried fruit from a grocery store. Dried fruit was basically anything that they could dry out in the sun. And so that was everything from vegetables to apples and berries. And these would be dried out, often sliced very thinly, and then they would be packed up with the family's goods and brought along on the journey. These would be used for flavoring other foods. But they would also sometimes be eaten just as is. So let's go ahead and try this out. So this is an example of dried fruit that would have been available to pioneers. As you can see, these apricots have been dried out, but they still have their shape. So this is the kind of fruit that you would eat just as is. If you had something like dried apple rings, you would often use those as a flavoring in things like your boil-in-the-bag puddings. And this is also the time period where things like pemmican would have been popular. Pemmican is a mixture of dried meat, dried fruit, and fat. It's sort of like it has everything that you need in it to keep you alive. This is something that would have been made by indigenous cultures long before pioneers arrived. But pioneers started making it too, because it's incredibly high in protein and fat and calories. And so it's the perfect trail food. Another staple of the Oregon Trail was hardtack. Was basically ship's biscuit. It was made of flour and water, and then it would be baked in a very hot oven until it was rock hard. This is something that could be made ahead of time, and then it would last the entire journey. It's pretty simple to make at home. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Okay, so right now, I've got my dough rolled out and ready to go. The only difference between this and modern biscuits is that we're rolling it out much thinner. And that's because we're going to bake this very, very hard. So our biscuits won't be very thick. All right. So here is our finished hardtack. This is something that would have traveled well, that would have lasted a very long time. But it's also something that was really, really hard to eat. Imagine trying to bite into this. It's very difficult. This is why pioneers would often carry a small hammer with them. They would take their hardtack and they would literally hammer it until it was smaller pieces that they could then eat. Another thing that they would often do is they would break it into small pieces and then they would boil it. They would add the hardtack to their boiling puddings, or they would just boil it until it was a little softer and easier to chew. One of the most popular foods that was eaten on the Oregon Trail was cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was basically the pioneer version of cereal. Every day they would add cornmeal to their pot of boiling water, and then that would thicken into a mush that they could eat for breakfast. It would often be flavored with things like dried fruit or molasses. if they had it. But let's go ahead and try this out. So right now I've got my cornmeal mixed with a little bit of water, and this is the consistency that you want it to be before you add it to your boiling water. So I'm adding it to my boiling water, and then I am going to stir it constantly to make sure that there aren't any lumps. Alright, so our cornmeal mush is almost ready. All I have to do is keep stirring it until it's thickened. And you'll see here in just a minute, it's going to start thickening. It's very similar to modern day grits. Once it's thickened, it will be ready to eat. One of the biggest difficulties that pioneers faced on the Oregon Trail was finding food. And that's especially true of the later pioneers because by the time they arrived, a lot of the easily accessible land had already been claimed. And so they were moving into more rugged terrain where finding food was much more difficult. And it was at this point that they started working more cooperatively with Native American tribes who knew the land better. But another difficulty was finding water. And this was especially true in the desert areas of Oregon. But there are certain plants that grow in the desert that have edible roots. And these roots can be dried and then ground into flour. So let's go ahead and give that a try. I've got my yampa root cleaned and cut up. Right now, I'm going to boil it. That will soften the root and then make it easier to dry and grind. Okay, so our yampa root has finished boiling. Now we're going to spread it out on our drying rack. So these roots are dried and ready to go. Now we're going to grind them up. And so right now we've ground up our yampa root, and this is what it looks like. So this is something that could be used as a flour. It would have been eaten by native tribes. Later, pioneers were able to purchase land and bring their own cattle with them. So instead of eating things like yampa, they were able to eat beef. So let's go ahead and give that a try. So I've got my beef chuck roast. I am going to season it with some salt and pepper, and then I am going to put it in my Dutch oven. So our beef is in the Dutch oven. All we have to do now is add coals on top and wait a little while. All right, so our beef has finished cooking. We re-go in to let it rest a little bit, and then we re-go in to slice it up. So here is our finished beef. This is something that would have been commonly eaten by pioneers, but it's important to remember that this was much later in the Oregon Trail time period. Much earlier in the time period, pioneers weren't bringing cattle with them, and they weren't eating meat like this. They were mostly eating things like dried fruit and cornmeal mush. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you've learned something new about the Oregon Trail. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so that you can join us for future videos.